Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, wherever you are. As Adrian said, my name is Don Taylor, and I'm a professor of labor education at the School for Workers at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I'm on the steering committee of the Havens Rights Center for Social Justice. Our presenter today is a founder of Labor Notes in the United States and is the author of several books about labor and politics. His 1988 book, An Injury to All: The Decline of American Unionism, was a very significant early read for me as a young union organizer. And this book remains relevant and in print today. His most recent book is called Breaking the Impasse: Electoral Politics, Mass Action, and the New Socialist Movement in the United States. He has a PhD from the University of Nottingham and is currently a visiting scholar at the University of Westminster in London. Please welcome Kim Moody.
Thanks to the Haven Rights Center for inviting me to do this, and to the organizations that co-sponsored this. It's been many years since I stood at the bar of the South Central Federation of Labor, so I'm glad to see them around. I'm sure you'd all rather be listening to Nancy Pelosi's Senate farewell speech, so I thank you a lot for coming to listen to what I have to say about things. I'm going to be talking about how capitalism has survived and flourished, or if you can call it that, for quite some time, to try to get at the question of the changes in work, the changes in the workforce, and to sort of debunk the idea that everything now is somehow immaterial, digitalized, and all of that. That in fact, we're living in a very material world that works differently from time to time, but nonetheless follows a lot of the same laws, if you will, or tendencies that capitalism has always followed. Just to start with a little theoretical kind of background here, I'm going to talk about how capitalism is driven by competition, and how in that speed, that is motion, time, are central to the way the system works. If you read Marx, you'll see that he talks a lot about motion. His economic categories are not still ones, they're ones about motion and time. He says, for example, that the velocity, that is the speed of circulation, can substitute for the volume of capital. In other words, if you can make a given amount of capital produce things faster, you can do it with less capital and still make more money. So he talks about turnover time, he and Engels. And what that is basically two elements. It's composed of two elements. The time of production, that's pretty obvious. We all know what that involves. And the time of what he calls circulation. Now, the term circulation is used by Marx and many others in so many different ways. What I'm using it here as is specifically the time and the distance between when, let's say, a capitalist invests in capital equipment and raw materials, labor, et cetera, the time it takes to get from there to the production process itself, and then the time of production, and then the time of circulation between sites of production, because there's nothing that is made or any service that is delivered that is done in a single place these days, if there ever was. And the time from that it goes to market and is sold and the profit is realized. So we have we have the circulation time and the production time. We'll see in a minute why I break it down that way. Labor productivity is one of the measures of production time. That's a pretty obvious one, aside from the obvious minutes and hours it takes to produce a service or a good. In the case of transportation, when Marx and Engels are writing about circulation time, they point to what were the big technological advances of their era, namely the railroad, steamships, and the telegraph. So we'll look at the modern versions of those things, the contemporary versions of those things in a minute. So I'm going to break down time, that is periods, into two. First, I'll call the neoliberal period of the 80s and 90s. This was the period of advance in production. This was the era of mean production, which you probably read about a lot or heard a lot about. Mean production was introduced into the United States in the 80s from Japan and then spread around the world. It spread initially from auto plants to virtually all kinds of work. And today you find it in services, in hospitals, and literally even in universities to a certain extent. You find the norms of lean production. So this period of the 80s and 90s was the period in which capitalism, using lean production, was still able to deal to a certain extent with its profitability problems and with competition by increasing the speed of production, by increasing the productivity of labor. However, capital ran into a kind of historic problem with the circulation side of this, the movement of labor and things between different points in this whole process, and the fact that the speed of trucks, trains, planes, and ships has not fundamentally changed in the last half a century or more. So how do you deal with the circulation problem? Well, one thing they did in that period of lean production was the introduction of containers. Containerization rationalized the movement of things from ships to trucks to rail, et cetera, eliminated tons of labor on the waterfront and elsewhere, and was one of the innovations of that period that allowed circulation time to be reduced to a certain extent. This was enabled by deregulation. Of course, it was a political thing that swept not only the United States, but much of the Western world, the capitalist world, the developed capitalist world, in that same period. But now, beginning in the 21st century, and some of these things, of course, begin a little bit before that, I want to call the 21st century the era of logistics. That is the art or science of how you move things most efficiently. It comes from the military originally, but has been applied to trade and the movement of goods for a long time. But what happened was by the 21st century, as productivity in manufacturing began to lose its power, began to grow more slowly or even stagnate in certain periods, capital turned more and more to the whole question of how you move these goods from the various points, from the investment to the production, different sites of production, from production to the market, and so on and so forth. And what makes this period different are some of the things that we're pretty familiar with that give this period a sort of very abstract, immaterial kind of feeling. And I'm talking about digitalization, the quantification of everything to a much greater degree because measurement through digitalization and all of that, quantification becomes far more precise and detailed than it was in the past. And when I'm talking about quantification, I'm talking about quantification of movement, quantification of labor, of things that even Taylor, with his stopwatch and all of that, couldn't have imagined, breaking labor down into nanoseconds and so forth. It's different movements. And of course, surveillance. That is the watching of the whole process of labor of human beings, but also the movement of the various methods of transportation and all of that made it possible for companies now to calibrate and quantify. They couldn't change the speed of a truck or a train, but they could change the route. They could change where it stopped. They could change the nodes in the sort of network that is a supply chain. So supply chains in this period were reorganized not only in their where they went and where they came from and so forth, but in the ability to change them and guide them through the use of big data and huge amounts of quantification and information, something that really didn't even exist to that degree in the era of lean production. So I want to look at just now the point I want to make here about these things, the changes in the 21st century, is that they are all labor dependent. The idea that these things operate on their own, that artificial intelligence even actually can do all these things, I think is a mystification. You need to understand that what makes all of that work, including artificial intelligence, are very material things that I will talk about, in a minute, that are all dependent on labor. And I'll try to show that very briefly. To begin with, the changes in the 21st century logistics revolution begin really with fiber optic cable. Now, we take that for granted, but actually it only really starts in the late 90s and then accelerates in the 21st century. So we're talking about something that as a functional piece of capital and the movement of things has really only been around for a couple of decades. Today, 95% of all internet traffic globally goes through fiber optic cable. So you may think that your phone, everybody has a phone, so there must be all this movement of data and voice, et cetera, that doesn't require cable, but the fact is it all rests on cloud. The thing about this fiber optic cables, that is both the undersea and the underground parts of it, is that they're actually owned by capital and operated by capital. And a lot of these companies are very familiar to us. AT&T is a big operator of underground fiber optic cable. Verizon is another one. Comcast. You might go through the list of these pretty giant telecom or communications corporations, internet service providers, and so forth, that are themselves major capitalist operators that actually own and control this. The workforce that makes this fiber optic network work is composed as of 2020 of a little over 244,000 workers. So we're not talking about a small thing. Some of these workers are actually unionized, people who work for AT&T, Verizon, and so forth, although not necessarily always the people who work on the fiber optic part of their networks. But nonetheless, there is a partial unionization there. Most are not. And that's something that the labor movement has to confront. One of the things that if lean production disoriented labor in the workplace, leading to concessions, leading to labor management cooperation programs, all kinds of things that undermine the traditional power of unions. This kind of change in communications and things that guide production and movement of goods and services and so forth is also disorienting. even though it's a large workforce. The next thing that's connected to this, and is also newer in a certain sense in wide practice, even newer, and that are data centers. Again, we're used to this. And you have to remember that before the 21st century, very few of even the largest corporations had what we would think of as a data center today. The government did, to be sure. The CIA, the NSA, all of these, they have their data centers in Northern Virginia. And interestingly enough, a great many of the new privately owned data centers are also located in that same area and, in fact, interact with those spy agencies and so forth, not surprisingly. But what is a data center? It's essentially a warehouse full of equipment, computer equipment, servers, and so forth. Again, we might think, well, now, just to quantify it a little bit, by one measure, there are about 1,200 of these things operating as of about a year ago in the US, maybe a little bit more by now. We might think because these are essentially warehouses full of computers that it all operates itself, but it doesn't. And it turns out that something like 40% of the costs of operating these data centers are labor costs. Well, that surprised me a lot because if you know anything about them, you know they are huge users of energy, misusers of energy, actually, and very reliant on fossil fuels and all of that. And yet, by some estimates, as much as 40% are labor costs. So I don't have figures on their workforce because there are no such figures, or at least not public figures that I could find. But if it's 40% of costs, we're talking about a substantial workforce. The other thing about this workforce is that according to studies that have been done on this, most of the jobs, and I'm actually quoting, most of the jobs do not require a high level of formal education. Mostly on-the-job training is sufficient to train these workers how to do the work they do in these centers. So here's another sizable section of the workforce that is kind of out of the vision of the labor movement today, for the most part, and that needs to be organized if we're going to get some kind of control over the way capitalism actually functions today. The next thing is may seem less spectacular in terms of technology, but that is the transformation of the warehouse. This actually goes back a little farther, but again, it accelerates in the 21st century. And what I'm talking about here is warehouses have ceased to be places of storage to a large extent and become places of movement, just like the trucks and trains, et cetera, that move between the warehouses, between factories, between hospitals and whatever. The warehouses today have become places where you move goods in and out as fast as possible. The innovator here, it was Walmart, beginning in the 90s, with the cross-dock warehouse. That's a warehouse which are now something like 40% of all warehouses in the US. That is where goods come in one door, are separated and go out another door and onto a bunch of different trucks that take them to their final destination and so forth. There is no storage at all. If you take an Amazon fulfillment center, of course, there has to be some storage because they're dealing with lots of projects. But the whole point about what goes on in the Amazon fulfillment center or any of their facilities really is to move things as rapidly as possible, and to do this by digitally guiding the workforce to pick things and move and pack and ship out as fast as possible. So the warehouse has become a place of movement. And if you're a place of movement, you're vulnerable. Warehouses are highly vulnerable to all kinds of things. So, by the way, our data centers, they have outages all the time, which is why they need so many workers here to keep them going to fix these things. The Amazon, the old Walmart model was to have their warehouses infrequent, but along the interstate highway system. The Amazon model is different, and I'm going to return to this later. It's very important. It's not only digitally driven in the warehouse in between all the facilities, but it's a dense network of facilities becoming more and more dense all the time. And that is close to not only the interstate highways, but to rail and intermodal yards that are themselves close to major markets. Looking at the warehouse workforce in 2012, there were about 581,000 workers. By early this year, there were over 1.5 million. So it's practically tripled in this decade. This is a very important part of how logistics have changed. Briefly look at old infrastructure too. That is roads, rails, and all of that. We know, from all what the politicians have been doing about infrastructure and Biden's bill and all of that, which, by the way, won't have much effect on this, but that the infrastructure system in the United States, the old one, the traditional one, is in bad shape, to put it mildly, with bridges collapsing and all of this kind of thing. However, at the same time, from a strategic point of view, looking at how capital moves things and how we might disrupt things, to put it bluntly, 79% of commodity traffic goes over 10% of the traditional transportation network, that is highways, rail, etc. So this is something else. Here, this workforce, which is difficult to estimate, but somewhere between 50 and 20 million people altogether. Only about 12% of it has a college education. So again, we're talking about a very proletarian style of workforce. And furthermore, the interesting thing is when we think of infrastructure, we think like Biden's bill, where we're putting all this money into building something, making new infrastructure or improving it or something. But 77% of the work in infrastructure is on maintenance, which means it's long-term jobs. So this is a regular workforce. Okay. So we have a new material infrastructure and an old one trying to work together, contradiction often, in the US and in fact around the world. But because of the increased connectivity due to digitalization and all that, because of the increase in speed, all of this is more vulnerable than it was even back in the 80s or 90s. A study of 397 companies over a decade found that disruptions, and these can be caused by weather, most of them are not caused by strikes, unfortunately. Most of them are caused by electrical outages or weather things, or delays in supply chains, things of that sort. The average one will knock sales down in the first month by just about 5%. But interestingly enough, it hits operating income, that is to say profits, by almost 27%, according to this study, looking at this over a 3-month period after an incident, as they call it. So that tells us that in today's situation, companies of various sorts, and this included quite a variety of companies, service, manufacturing, transportation, et cetera, companies are highly vulnerable to direct action. The other thing that tells us a lot about the vulnerability of these things is the global supply chain crisis we just saw coming out of the pandemic. It wasn't the pandemic that caused it. It did kind of set it off with the first series of lockdowns and all of that. But basically, the supply chain crisis has been long in the making. And the two things that underlie it most are, one, the more obvious one is the rise in fuel prices. And this starts before the Ukraine invasion of Ukraine, which of course has accelerated it. but it started before that. The other thing, though, and I think is actually more important and more interesting to us, is that the cause of the underlying cause of the supply chain crisis by virtually all of the industry sources are labor shortages. That is, it's a kind of strike by not taking the jobs that keeps this system vulnerable and not working, subject to delays and failures of all sorts. And the labor shortages are pretty much worldwide, at least in the developed capitalist countries, and also are mainly in trucking, rail, and warehousing. These are the three areas of land transportation that are mainly affected by these labor shortages. Now, why is there a labor shortage? Well, it doesn't take a lot of analysis to figure that one out. Most of these jobs, with some exceptions, are low paying, poor jobs, or I should say, they are extremely difficult, unpleasant jobs, or even dangerous jobs in many cases, like rail jobs and so forth. The reasons for the labor shortages are a little different in each case, but basically it always comes down to this. These companies cannot get enough people to do the work that could be done, if they could hire this kind of work. Well, that tells us right then and there that strikes or job actions of almost any sort can have a serious impact on the whole supply chain setup, and therefore on all kinds of points in the in the system of logistics and production that exists today. And that brings us back to the centrality of labor in all of this that I wanted to emphasize. Most of the workforce I described is outside of the labor movement today. On the other hand, there are more NLRB elections than there usually have been. There are more strikes. But although this is a welcome development in many respects, the numbers are still pretty low. Most of the NLRB elections that win are for very small units. There are exceptions like the Amazon warehouse in New York and so forth. But a lot of the Starbucks things that are winning, which is great, but these are small units. By the way, of course, you probably know today it's the national Starbucks strike. I don't know how that worked out, but it's supposed to be a strike of all the unionized and unionizing Starbucks facilities around the U.S. So that's a good development too. On the other hand, the unions, with exceptions here and there, although they do organizing and everything, there is a sense, even in a lot of the mainstream literature, that they're kind of stuck in the mud when it comes to growth. They're not growing. That's obvious. Furthermore, because they're not growing, they no longer have the kind of income you get from membership dues, and they've reduced their organizing staffs in many cases, a lot of them, so that they're really not in the kind of mode that, given what's going on right now, or the potential, I believe, that is there, they're really not living up to it. On the other hand, and this is the most important thing, and this, I think, is where any analysis has to begin of what's going on now, is that an awful lot of what's happening is workers organizing themselves. Whether they do so to join a SERU affiliate, or whether they set up a separate union of their own, the Amazon Labor Union, or the Amazonians United, or all these different kind of organizations that are happening, these workers in these kind of settings, of course, they're not the same. Starbucks is not at all the same as Amazon and everything, but in these different settings where you have a workforce that is, particularly in Amazon, diverse and young and so on, they are organizing themselves. And what is the significance of this? Anytime unions have grown, the labor movement has grown, has been because workers took it upon themselves to organize themselves. If you look at the 1930s, this was so much the case. This is, of course, a debate among academics, but generally speaking, I think the people who show that, that it was workers in the mines, mill factories, et cetera, who began organizing themselves that made that upsurge possible. Certainly, if we look at the kind of, I don't know what you call it, the shop that was heard around the country in Michigan, the General Motors sit-down strike and everything. This was not, this was organized by people who had been in the industry or were in the industry, usually led by radicals of one sort or another, and, who pulled this thing off without having the unions that existed in the UAW at that time, didn't have a huge treasury and didn't have a huge staff, all of this. And that was possible. If you look again, something that I was personally part of, that is the upsurge of public sector workers in the 60s and 70s. Again, these were mostly, whether they joined the AFSCME or FCRU or set up an independent union that I was involved in, and the others were, these workers organized themselves. They didn't even have a law that helped them do it in most cases. And so what I'm saying is if what's happening now in Amazon and Starbucks and many other, and a growing number of other situations, even if most of them are fairly small so far, if this is an indication of what's happening, then something big is in the works. And it's up to the labor movement to begin to figure out how it works. I just seem to have lost. Can anybody see me? Somebody tell me?
We can still see you, Kim.
Okay, sorry. I hit the wrong thing. If this is, what's going on, then I think there is hope for the working class in the United States and elsewhere, because this is not just happening in the United States. In a way, it's more advanced here in Europe than it is in the US, but it is happening now. And so when I want to look at Amazon for that, the reason for looking at Amazon is that not only do I think it's the General Motors Flint of our era, but because it is the model of all the other things I was talking about. It is the quintessential model of all the new ways of work, of logistics, of production. We don't think of it as production, but a lot of it is in fact production or productive labor anyway. And if you can organize Amazon, if you can make a breakthrough on Amazon, I think then, we are talking about a big possible breakthrough. I'll just say a couple of things about that. The importance of Amazon as a model of everything else lies in a couple of things. The first thing is the tightness of the way things move within the Amazon system, including workers, of course, but the way workers, et cetera, move goods within Amazon and between Amazon facilities is all guided by artificial intelligence and all of this kind of thing. And yet, if as Amazon workers stop picking or stop packing or stop shipping, putting things on trucks and so forth, artificial intelligence cannot move a thing. So I'm not saying it's easy to do that in an Amazon warehouse, but it is nonetheless a fact. The very tightness of the way, and if you read their own SEC Form 10s, for example, how they talk about these various things, it's kind of interesting that they make it very clear that their profit comes from the rapidity of their turnover, almost going back to the same language I was using in the beginning. The rapidity of their turnover. Well, what is that? That is, of course, the ability of this workforce, driven by all this technology and using the technology, to move these things constantly and fast. Furthermore, between the motion between the different between, a fulfillment center and a distribution station and so forth, is also tight. Although again, in that case, they're using contract labor, as they do often in the warehouses too. So there are all those kind of problems. But I believe that when people get moving, this idea that having different formal employers is a barrier to organizing has generally been shown to not be true historically, that you can knock this down and basically force these employers, as, for example, the longshore workers did in the 30s, these different employers to get together and bargain with you, if you have the strength to do that. So it's the movement of, keep doing this. It's the movement of things in this tight sense that makes Amazon potentially vulnerable. The second thing, which some people believe is the reason that they have flexibility, as I mentioned earlier, is the density of their warehouses and various facilities. If you look at how they are increasing the number of their facilities, it's astronomical. It just goes, it's kind of slowed down now because they're losing money at the moment, but it has, they're adding a couple of hundred of these things a year or more in some years. And they're getting denser and denser in major locations, major urban markets that they are near, and the rail centers and the highways and the intermodal yards, which are very important to all of this. The density has to do with the ability to not have to move things over long distances, I believe, but also the ability to move things faster, through each stage. You're talking about millions of products that they sell every day, so you're talking about sorting things out. Having this kind of density rationalizes and makes that easier. Well, just one more point on this. The Amazon model is important because of changes that are taking place in all the things I've talked about, all the logistics situation. They have discovered, as a result largely of the global supply chain crisis and the pandemic and all of that, they have discovered that that these things are highly vulnerable, that having only one, the lead production norm, having, say, one supplier, or having a just-in-time arrival of goods to your warehouse and so forth, or to your factory or hospital or wherever it is, that this makes you more and more vulnerable. So there is, I put myself through agony by reading any number of these global surveys of management talking about what their plans are for the coming year. And they're all saying pretty much the same thing. That is, we're moving away from just-in-time, and we're moving away from single source supply chains to multiple source and all of that. Now, you might think, well, okay, isn't that going to make them less vulnerable? Yes, in many cases it will, and there can be problems here. But it doesn't eliminate the fight for speed that they will still be doing. It doesn't eliminate that. Furthermore, remember, just in time, people think of that as something that is fast. It's fast in production, but in the transport circulation part, it's inefficient. That is, more truckloads of smaller loads is more expensive than bringing a big truckload of parts to a warehouse, to keep there for a while, or to a factory or whatever kind of facility it is. So the just-in-time thing will continue, I think, inside the production process, but not in the supply chain. So what we have to the reason I mentioned the Amazon model is that the substitute for this, if you're having multiple sources, and if you're having bigger shipments and all that, one thing you want to try to do is eliminate the length and distance and cost of the shipping, and to make the sources, the supply sources, closer to you. So we're going to have this density that on Amazon is going to become more norm. And that is what these management people are saying in these surveys. They're saying they want to reshore supply chains. They want to nearshore, this is all jargon, of course. It does not mean that supply chains will cease to be global or international, but it means there will be more of a tendency to concentrate things within the nation, but within the market area, usually a larger area and so forth. Now that to me means that what they are creating now, they may have weakened our ability to stop them in certain ways, but they are creating a concentrations of workers and facilities and capital and movement within these that becomes a greater target for organization. And I think I go back to Amazon because I think if you break Amazon, you can get in there and organize that. If the workers there have enough support from the outside, and not just from unions, but from social movements and people who are willing to help out in various ways and so forth. If you can crack Amazon, I believe then the rest will begin to fall into place. And maybe we could talk a little bit about how that might be done and so on. But I think what I want to, that's the message I want to leave us with. Amazon is the model for now. It is the General Motors in Flint of this period that we're at. And it is where organized labor should turn its attention, if it can do so in a cooperative and coordinated fashion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kim. I hope everyone will join me in a round of virtual applause for Kim's remarks. We'll now move to Q&A and discussion. So I'm going to take questions in groups of 3. You can ask a question in one of 2 ways. One, you can type your question into the chat and I will read it out for you, or you can navigate to the bottom of your Zoom window under the reactions button, click that, and then it will signal a raise hand, in which case I will be able to see you and call on you, and then I will ask you to unmute yourself, turn on your video so that we can all see you and you can ask your question that way. So we already have a question on deck, which is wonderful, from Ronald. Ronald, I am going to ask you to unmute and then you can ask your question.
Kim, I found your analysis very, very interesting, particularly focusing on labor shortages. I think one reason why there might be labor shortages is because within the Amazon model, there is no job security. The whole idea is basically to work people until they quit. Most people take jobs on a short-term basis because in many areas of the country, they can earn more money working for Amazon than they could for any other private employer. And I think you're quite right to say, use the analogy of the Flint General Motors situation, because it was speed ups that actually drove those workers to go on strike. And I think in Amazon, it's the intense pace of labor. It's the atrocious terms of employment. And I think this was magnified during the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, where people were risking their lives to go to work because the management was insensitive to health and safety standards. So it's not really a question, but it's maybe just a point basically to take forward. Do you think that those kind of conditions are existing in other warehouses or other workplaces that you talked about?
Yeah, Ron, you hit the nail on the head, so to speak. it's like two contradictory things here with Amazon as it is at the moment. That is huge turnover due to lack of not just job security, but because of what you said, the work is so intense that it just is, it's very difficult to tolerate this for a long time. First of all, does this exist in other places? Yes, it does, because Amazon is the model. People talk about the Amazonization of retail in general. Not only that, but the Amazonization of hospitals. Can you imagine that? Well, they already did land production in hospitals, so why not further work intensification and so forth? Yes, I think that's why I call it a model. Just like lean production was a model, introduced into auto plants in the early 80s in the US and spread rapidly throughout industry. I think the Amazon model of labor intensity and to a certain extent, even the lack of job security, the turnover, which in a previous time management would have thought was a disadvantage, that management these days feels it's somewhat of an advantage. So I think, yes, other workers do that. But I think here we're talking about two things that relate to each other, but also present a contradiction. Generally speaking, in industries that have been organized where there is a high turnover or where there was a shake-up kind of system where you didn't have a regular job and so forth, what happens is once the workers do finally get together to overcome the horrible conditions that follow from that kind of work, the jobs tend to become more secure. People stay longer because you improve the work conditions, you get better pay, and you discover that since everybody else has adopted the Amazon model, you're not going to find a much better job. And by the way, that's pretty much what surveys are saying. People are moving. They don't just leave Amazon; they go somewhere else. After a while, perhaps they go somewhere else. What do they discover there? Well, it's just as bad. Maybe not quite as high tech and all of that, but that the bullying and surveillance and the video-driven work and all that is more and more universal. So on the one hand, that drives people to organize. On the other hand, once they begin to organize, people stick around. And that's the story that comes out of places like the Amazon facility, in Staten Island. And say, well, now people are going to stick around more, be part of the union. I'm not sure that it's everybody or anything like that, but you get a core of people who are going to stay to organize, to keep organizing, and so on. So that would be my answer there. That we do have a very circulating workforce in Western capital, China and elsewhere too, not just here. But on the other hand, once people begin to rebel, they have a reason to stay. And that kind of historically what happens. So let's hope that's true. And if people see, if Amazon workers who are beginning to try to organize, see that there are people on the outside, organizations, unions, etc., that are willing to support them, that's another reason why people will stick around for the fight. That's all.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kim. So next we're going to go to Sam Friedman, followed by Callie Judd, followed by Phil G. So Sam, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself and please ask your question.
Kim, great talk. In some of your books, you've discussed how racial and geographic dynamics in the United States have meant that logistics issues of the kind you're talking now open up some real possibilities for organizing politically. Now, I'm wondering if you've had any further thoughts on that, particularly as the density of locations in some of these bigger companies have gotten more intense.
Thank you, Sam. I'll next go to Callie. Callie, if you would unmute yourself, please.
Hi there. So I guess I was wondering more about the pandemic element. I'm sorry, my computer mic is really bad, so I'm just going to lean in. So two very related questions, and if you can only field one, of course. So mostly I was just wondering predictions about labor standards in relation to COVID-19. I mean, as we're aware, OSHA has very few indoor air quality standards, thanks to Reagan. So I'm wondering, do you think we're going to see more of this in an attempt to combat the labor shortage? Because, of course, the other option is raising wages, and wages being sticky, people don't want to do that. So labor standards, you can pull away. Wages, people flip shit or freak out. Sorry. And then my other question in relation is, long COVID is estimated to cost the economy, I think, what Larry Summers a few years ago predicted like 2.3 trillion. Since then, of course, we've realized it's far more ubiquitous than we think. I think now estimates are around 4 trillion, 230 billion in lost wages and stuff. So I'm wondering also how we're going to see the effects of disability, lost quality of life, lost earnings, lost wages on worker movements in general, because obviously if people are sick at work, they're not going to be able to perform their jobs, but they're also going to be very unhappy. So I'm wondering, is there going to be some fervor there? Do you think it's even possible with, of course, the nature of long COVID? So.
Thank you, Callie. And next, finally, we'll go to Phil G for this round. Phil G, please ask your question after you unmute.
Thanks for the talk, Kim. There was a report that came out this summer, I don't know if you saw it, written by Chris Boner, called Labor's Fortress of Finance, about the financial resources that the labor movement actually controls. And you mentioned that union membership is going down and union dues have gone down, but at the same time, unions are sitting, according to the report, on over $29 billion of assets. And that's net assets. Doesn't include pension funds. And yet the money which they're spending on organizing has gone down. They spend less now than they did 10 years ago on hiring organizers. The amount which is spent on strike support, according to the report, has averaged $70 million a year since 2010, which is, it's less than 0.5% of their total assets. So they're not using those resources. It's kind of an indictment, I think, of the whole strategy that has been employed by the major unions in the US. So I'm just interested in your thoughts or your comments on that part of the picture, and what does that tell us about what we need to do to revive the labor movement? And the resources are there, but they're not being used.
Thank you, Phil. Kim, 3 meaty questions for you.
Indeed. Let me go to the first one last, because I did indeed read that article. It actually appeared in Labor Notes. I had my view of that is that the person who wrote that got it upside down. What those figures actually show is that unions are no longer able to support themselves on the basis of their own members' dues. Wasn't the idea of a worker organization that is self-supporting and not dependent on capital? What are these assets that we're talking about here? This is capital, stocks, bonds, government, things, and so forth. Yes, it would be great if they would liquidate all that and use them to organize, but I don't believe they're going to, for the simple reason that because they can no longer sustain the level of union bureaucracy that many unions have developed over the decades on the basis of membership dues, they rely now on those assets. That is their fallback. That is their cushion, so to speak. And so we might want to try to force them to use that for something good rather than just more expansion of themselves and high salaries and all the rest of it. But I'm skeptical that's going to happen. But okay, it's worth a try. But I think the thing that we should be alarmed about, and I actually began researching this almost 20 years ago when the change took place. You could see it happen in the, from the 60s and 70s into the 80s and 90s, whereas unions used to be basically able to sustain themselves on membership dues. And if they had assets, it would be limited to government bonds. The UAW, which I looked at in detail at that time, switched somewhere in the 80s, in the middle of lean production and labor management cooperation. I don't think there's an accidental relationship here. They switched to playing the stock market. They bought an airline, which of course was a complete flop. But all of these kind of things that the union hierarchy in a lot of the unions, turned to essentially, capital reliance on stock market. It was a bad idea in this era because these are going to be extremely volatile. These wonderful assets that were in that report could be wiped out, or at least largely wiped out in a relatively short period of time. So I'm less than thrilled about that report. I have to admit. So let me go backwards about the pandemic and stuff. I don't think I can answer this all, but I do want to say that it is correct that all these working conditions and the change in supply chains are an enabler of pandemics. And to the question, will there be more? You bet there will be. Mike Davis got that right, for sure. And when the pandemic started, I looked just out of curiosity, being obsessed with logistics and all that. I looked at, well, where did it come from and where did it go? In the earliest stages from Wuhan, it followed the major logistical trails, trade trails of that period, of that time. Now later, of course, it spread more generally and so forth. But you can see all of this tight global supply chain logistical setup has also enabled the spreading of pandemic, which spread in a matter of weeks, as opposed to, I looked up at the 1919 so-called Spanish flu thing. That took quite a while to spread from Turkey and so forth, from America actually, around the world, and it spread through the trenches of World War I and all of that. And if you go back farther, to the plague and all that, it took years for the thing to spread. This took weeks. And part of the reason for that was this logistical supply chain movement of people and things, including passenger movement. So the first one in Seattle was a passenger, but so in the workplace, yes, when Amazon hires huge numbers of people. I mean, it's just quite amazing the growth of their workforce. And so these huge things, have not hundreds of employees, but as we know now, thousands of employees working in, a single place or a close complex and so forth. Well, yes, if you don't have proper ventilation, if you don't have PPE, if you don't have all the things you need to prevent the pandemic, you're going to have it again or the same one over, or whatever the next one that comes along is going to be. So yes, I think again another reason to unionize these days is working conditions, in the sense that health and safety and working conditions are never the same thing, and disease, and so. Yes, the government setup for that is totally inadequate to all of this. The health and safety regulations and so forth, they're decades out of date. And all of that definitely needs to change, and that needs to be something that unions take on, in a stronger way. Sam asked me about race and geography and politics. I don't want to go there too much, but I think one of the things that we see with the development of logistic clusters and now the Amazon type cluster is that areas are change. I did a study of Will Kennedy outside of Chicago and looked at that over a period going back to the 70s and 80s and up to now. And politically, it changed radically. There was a farm community basically with some industry and Joliet for a long time, but basically small working class and a large rural population. The term rural can be very misleading in this respect, by the way. A lot of rural people and workers, but and I don't need farmers. But with the coming of the warehouses in the beginning of the early 2000s, and so forth, the actual politics of the whole county changed completely. It went from being overwhelmingly Republican to being not only overwhelmingly Democratic, but in the 2016 primaries, Bernie Sanders got more votes than Donald Trump in the separate primaries. So that could have happened 10 or 20 years later. So you see that. I'm not saying that we want everybody to be Democrats. There obviously it's not on politics, but these changes are changing the social content of of a lot of places, including what used to be known suburbs or even exurbs. The problem is that actual politics, electoral politics, as we've seen in the midterms, hasn't caught up with that fact at all. The Democrats are clueless on this, by the way. They're still chasing well-to-do suburbanites and all that they don't like Trump, which apparently they don't anymore, which is fine, but it doesn't really change the political situation very much. So race has everything to do with it, because some of these workers who came into Will County, they were largely Latino. Will County always had a Black population, but it was small, it's grown. But the big change, the big demographic change, were Latino workers, largely immigrant workers coming there, beginning in the early 2000s. Now a lot of their children are becoming of voting age, and that changes the voting demographics of these places as well. So I think, thinking about independent working class politics, we're not necessarily going very far on that tonight, but thinking about that, yes, I think there's some real possibilities. Amazon, of course, getting back to that one, is the perfect multi-racial, multicultural, workforce, multi-age workforce, etc. And that too, can have a political impact as more and more Amazon facilities fill up counties like Will County or DuPage County around Chicago and the Inland Empire near Los Angeles and so forth. The possibilities of a different kind of working class politics, it seems to me, are there and could very well come in the wake of or as part of, the organization of these jobs I've been talking about.
Kim, we now have a question from the chat, and then I will move on to Seattle Revolutionary Socialists, so please be ready. The question from the chat is from Patrick Barrett, who writes, I have a question regarding the Biden infrastructure bill. Given the importance of circulation of capital and its heightened dependence on the modernization of infrastructure, what explains the long-standing pitiful state of infrastructure in the U.S. and the failure to address it sooner and in a more robust way? The easy answer is political gridlock. But since big business is by far the most important constituency for both political parties, one would think that this is an area where that gridlock wouldn't come into play, at least not as much. Indeed, the passage of the bill stands out as an exception in that it's gained support from both parties, but it remains to be explained why it didn't happen sooner and go farther. Does it? Does it speak to a division between capital and the contemporary GOP, for example? So that's question one. Now, Seattle, I'm going to ask you to unmute and ask your question.
Okay. Yeah, my name is Steve Lee from Seattle Rollers for Socialist. First of all, Kim, that was fantastic, as always. Question about organizing. There seem to be two different models of organizing among Amazon workers and other people, and that is the more traditional collective bargaining route, like the Amazon Labor Union, and then Starbucks workers are generally trying that route as well. Starbucks Workers United, and then you have the Amazonians United, who explicitly do not want, as far as I know anyway, are not aiming at collective bargaining agreements, but instead are aiming at changing conditions on the shop floor by continually using direct action, et cetera, et cetera. So given the model that you laid out, do you have any pictures about which models are going to be more effective, or how that's all going to play out in terms of those different models? Because it really seems like there's massive resistance by the corporations to anything, right? So Starbucks has said, yes, we'll negotiate, and then they pull back and don't negotiate, and then they continue to fire people, and people continue to strike, but there's not, at this point, not at least on a national scale, any kind of major breakthrough. So anyway, just thanks a lot, and thanks for the answers.
Thank you very much. As you said, it's one thing to win an election. It's another thing to actually hammer out a contract. And so on this note, I will ask Kim my question. I'm curious if you could articulate for us what you think the role of the state is here. In the chat, there has been a lot of talk about the very unfriendly, or depending on, I guess, your perspective, unfriendly law on behalf of labor on the books. And we've seen most recently Secretary of Labor, who shan't be named, putting his thumb on the scale against potential railway workers, a key element and a key target that you articulated earlier in your talk. I'm curious what you think its orientation will continue to be, and if there are ways that workers might leverage their power to encourage it one way or the other. Thanks.
Okay, good. My turn. Okay, on that, yes, of course, American labor law is just worse than useless, and all of that. A lot of people think the solution is the PRO Act, the reform of the labor relations law and so forth, the reform of the NLRB, and two things about that. A, there is no chance in hell that it's going to pass, so you can forget about relying on that. The second one, if it did, it might help a little bit. But I look back again, my two examples of the upsurge of unionism, the 1930s, when sit-down strikers looked at the situation, they looked at the NLRB of that time. It was a fairly new law, had not been declared constitutional yet, so it was a little up in the air. They looked at that and they said, no, forget that. We're not going now. And they went through direct actions, and planned occupation and so forth, and that worked. And so, and then again, you look at the upsurge of public sector workers. Almost no states, I was involved in that in the state of Maryland, in Baltimore, and there was no labor law covering public sector workers at all. We had a lawyer who worked for us pro bono, and he said, well, it's nice to have a lawyer around, but there isn't any law, so let's do it. So we just ignored all that and went ahead and organized a union, and it worked. And people did that all across the country at that time. Maybe not quite as dramatic as the 1930s, but very important nonetheless. And by the way, that was, my experience in that was, if you want to know the relationship between, say, race and class, that was a spin-off of the civil rights movement, if ever there was one. certainly where I was. So my attitude toward the law is mostly that if we're going to get on, we're going to end up breaking most of the time. And that's difficult. That's a problem. People will get arrested. Unions will get fined. Ooh, some of those big assets they have, will go to those fines and all of that. But I just, the hope that legislation is going to save the labor movement, I just think not there. It's going to be organization and direct action again, as it almost always is anywhere. I'm sure you probably agree with that. On Steve's question, I mean, it's interesting that while he was describing the two poles there, I was thinking in my head, AFL versus IWW. We're going to go with regular union on the one hand, like the Amazon labor union people, although they're not an official AFL union or anything like that. Or on the other hand, the Amazonians United, who say they don't want regular collective bargaining or to be a union. With all that that entails, a hierarchy, and all the rest of it. What I would say about that, and my guess about that, is that if there is more of an upsurge among Amazon workers, and if all the little things that are going on around that system, and there are lots of them, strikes on Prime Day, and all of that, important things happening there, they will converge. And good if we get a little more IWW, a little less AFL, and the new organizations that come out of that. That's fine by me. I think that's a piece of our historic spirit that we should not lose. And although I think it will end up as collective bargaining in one form or another, it doesn't have to be the kind of over ritualistic and kind of dead sort of collective bargaining that we have that assumes so many limitations. Like, how do we deal with the pandemic if you're through collective bargaining? There isn't an obvious, aside from, simple things like PPE or something like that, there isn't an obvious way to do that in the traditional system. So we have to break out of that and understand that. Just like we have to introduce things about sexual harassment at a time when that wasn't part of collective bargaining. So we're going to have to introduce all these new things. And to do that, direct action, the IWW spirit, that I hope is what happens, that it's more of a merger than a fight in Amazon. And that would be my guess, because I suspect the people who are in both those camps are pretty much the same, have pretty much the same concerns. I mean, I don't know, maybe there are ideological currents in each thing I'm not aware of. But as far as I know, I think there is the possibility for, unifying all of that. There was something else here. Whoops, I can't. Oh, the infrastructure question. Yeah, the infrastructure question. I don't know the ins and outs of the Infrastructure Act. I have to tell you, I did not follow that. I'm trying to follow electoral politics, but there is kind of a limit to what you can do and keep your sanity with this stuff. Gridlock is part of the answer. The thing about all the infrastructure bills historically is that this is a major source of pork in the old pork barrel. I mean, it's not old, it's set-asides and all these things that, of course, the Republicans are going to be for some of this because their buddies in the construction industry, et cetera, are going to get contracts. That's what it is. This is not some big state-run thing where we're going to nationalize, transport or something like that. We're talking about handing out money to private firms. Well, the Republicans aren't against that. Are there divisions in capital about where the money should go? Of course there are. Finance wants that, and industry wants this, and construction wants that, and so forth. And there are times they do conflict. And they do fight each other. I don't know if that's what would happen here, but I'm not surprised. And most of all, I'm not surprised at its limitations. And here again, anything, the Democrats start out with, which is usually much less than is needed by a long shot, and ends up being much less than even that. Not even by the Republicans, by their own right wing, so forth, is because, among other things, to be simply crude, electoral politics are all about money today. I mean, these elections that we just went through are coming to about $4 to $5 billion worth of money that went into the primaries and the general election. It'll probably end up being more than that when the final calculations were made. And all the fights between people, you can read a lot of the commentators and people like that. They start judging the thing not only by the personalities of this guy, a Trump maniac or something like that, but by how much money went into their campaign. And rightfully so, because mostly, not always, but mostly, she or he who gets more money wins. Not always, as I say, but on average, more often than not. And they all know that. So they're not going to pass laws that are going to severely tax the people who are getting the money, whether it's the lunatics like Bankman-Fried or the more traditional sources of capital that are behind the Democrats or those that are behind, the Republicans. And I think that limitation is both ideological but also financial. You can't run an election these days for something as high as Congress, let alone the Senate or something like that, without being able to raise probably something in excess of $1 billion for primary and hope to win. It's just sort of the way it is. It doesn't have to be that way. One of the reasons it's that way, by the way, is because elections today are run by high-priced professional consultants. Very seldom do we have a model of grassroots campaigning and organization. And even when you have door knocking and stuff, most of it is done digitally by targeting the people who are most likely to vote for your candidate instead of mobilizing large numbers of people. So they say, well, the turnout this time is bigger, than it's been, not as big as 2018, but bigger than previous years. Yes, it is, but actually it turned out most of the increase is due to more Republican voting, or more people voting Republican, which is a little alarming. But anyway, I just think there are so many limits on what the Democrats are willing to do legislatively, because the money there that you would have to get from taxing the wealthy, taxing corporations substantially. I mean, not just the things they've done. They're not going to do that. What can I do?
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. And Bridget Fowler, you are it. So I will ask you to unmute yourself to ask your question.
Thanks very much. Yeah. I'd like to ask a question which comes more from a British and a French perspective than from a US perspective. Bourdieu and his colleagues wrote a work called The Weight of the World in 1993, in which he talked about the end of a world, meaning the end of traditional working class trade unionism, French communism, etc. Loic Vacan referred in relating to this as being about, perhaps you could say, the unmaking of the working class, using the E.P. Thompson model of the making of the working class and talking about the unmaking of the working class. And we know recently in the Daniel Dorling's research that now only 7% of workers in the private sector in Britain are in unions. In France and in Britain, there have been the deployment of temporary workers to break the power of permanent workers, and so on. I won't go into the ways in which universities have been expanded, so as to create meritocratic illusions. But I'm wondering whether what you're saying is that there are limits to this process, this unmaking of the English working class, and that the processes which managers have adopted to effect such an unmaking, like the dependence on just-in-time production and very limited supply chains, have these had their own contradictory elements, which now means that perhaps we might say Bourdieu was too pessimistic about the end of a world.
Okay. Yes, I would say that. I think there's Bourdieu, before him it was Andre Gortz, et cetera, theoreticians who have analyzed the working class out of existence, and so on. I would say that my answer to that has been, and still is, that the working class has to be understood just like capitalism itself is something that is constantly changing. This is always the same. The point of capitalism is to produce value, not cars or toothpaste. It's to produce value. If you can do that in a different way, they will do it in a different way. If you can do it using a different labor process, more casual labor and so forth, they will do that, and of course have done that. Although sometimes that can be exaggerated. One of the things I discover in looking at all this logistics stuff is that, for example, in the United States, if you put all the figures together of infrastructure workers and logistics and transportation and all those things, they outnumber manufacturing workers 2 to 1. Well, now that's strange. It takes more people to move things than it does to make them. Well, because of course things are made all over the world. So if you want to look at capitalism and working class, you actually have to look at it globally too. Are there more workers, even factory workers, or fewer? Actually, there are more. They're just in different places. They're not in Britain as much as they used to be, but there are workers here, and by heavens, they're striking all over the place here in the UK right now. The nurses are about to go out, and it's actually quite interesting to watch this revival of the labor movement that a lot of people thought was dead. It isn't quite dead. It needs to grow, absolutely, by organizing these new elements in the working class. And the same in the US, and for that matter, throughout the world, actually. So, yes, I think that the idea of the working class as simply factory workers or truck drivers it's never been the whole working class. And even Marx is clear on that. I mean, he always talks about factory workers and stuff, but when you read into more deeply into this, he's talking about the working class isn't even just the people who work. It's everybody who's dependent on one way or another on the total wage of the working class, and state provision and so forth. So I don't agree with Bourdieu. I didn't agree with George, and whoever the next one is, and there will be a next one. I probably won't agree with that. But I do agree that the working class has changed. And if we only looked at factory workers, we would miss the bigger picture. That workers in services are concentrated in huge workplaces, that many of which are larger than factories these days. Certainly that's the case, with Amazon facilities, and not just Amazon, but all the warehouses. In the last year, they built 1,250 new, just in the last year, new warehouses in the United States. That's 3 times what would have been built 4 or 5 years before that. And they're hiring more. But I think I mentioned workforce expanded, practically tripled in the last decade of those kind of workers. So just warehouse workers alone. And I would argue that these workers, including most transportation workers, are workers who produce value in the classic Marxist sense. I don't want to get into all the quotes and all that stuff, but I would argue that. So, and the working class today is more racially and gender diverse and so forth in so many ways. But we couldn't imagine, you know, you look at the workforce of the 30s or even the public workforce of the 60s and 70s and compare it to the workforce of Amazon or logistics in general, or even factory labor in the South and so forth of the United States, or here in the UK as well. You know, the working class not only has different occupations and skills and so forth, it looks different than it used to, and it doesn't dress like it used to. You look back at those pictures of striking doctors, excuse me, in 1880, they're all wearing suits. You can't even find a capitalist who wears a suit anymore. You know, everybody, it all looks different. And so we have to, you know, you have to understand the working class as a living, breathing, changing part of the system that makes the whole thing work, and hopefully it's the force that will not end history, but end capitalism.
That's a perfect place to end it. Thank you so much, Kim. On behalf of the Havens Wright Center for Social Justice, Contour, the UW School for Workers, and Scuffle, the South Central Federation of Labor, I'd like to thank you again for your insightful analysis and discussion comments. Thank you, everyone, for attending today. We hope to see you at our final lecture for the semester in 2 weeks. Until then, take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your questions.